Hi, everybody. Welcome to another edition of Ask Andrew. Every week, via the Film Studies Online section of the Bryn Mawr Film Institute website, people submit some questions that they have about the movies, and I do my best to answer some of them. If you have any questions about movies, I will do my best to answer them, so please consider submitting them via the website. Now, on to today's first question. John asks, how well can we use the hero's journey to analyze film? Does it work for TV seasons? Well, this is an interesting question because it brings up the larger issue of how we analyze films more broadly. And there are a number of options for how to analyze films. We can now analyze them culturally, based on what they say about a particular culture or in comparison to other cultures. We can look at them historically, what they say about a certain historical moment in which they were made or about which they are trying to tell us something. Although films usually are much more informative about the moment in which they are made than the moment in which the story is set. We can look at films technically, what has changed in filmmaking technology from one film to another. We can look at films aesthetically, what sort of techniques and cinematic devices are being used and how are those used to communicate with us as an audience, and how do they reflect the filmmaker's style, or how do they vary from character to character. And we can look at films in more of what I think would be called a literary style or through a literary lens. And that's kind of what John is getting at when he talks about the hero's journey. And I think, frankly, it's a very interesting way to look at a film. We all know from whatever we learned in school about writing stories that you should want your story to have a beginning, a middle, and end. Typically, that beginning, middle, and end is closely related to your hero or your protagonist's journey. And we should want our main characters to change somehow over the course of the movie, whether it is they change something about their personality or their character, they achieve a goal, they fail to achieve a goal they've been striving for, or they affect a change on the world, something like that. But we do want characters to be dynamic. We do want them to change. But we want that change to be grounded in elements of the story that's being told and in things that we see and hear in the film. One of the things I find interesting to do in certain movies is to look at sort of where the movie, the very beginning and the very end of the movie, to sort of see what characters we start with, what characters we end with, or what moments in those characters' lives or journeys we begin with and end with. Because sometimes a movie that you think is about a certain character is really maybe about another character, depending on where the story begins and ends. And sometimes a movie you think is about a particular issue or, cultural concern or theme or something might begin and end with a different element of the film, of the plot of the story altogether, which calls into question whether the movie was really about that other thing to begin with. So I think there's a lot that can be learned and a lot of appreciation can come from analyzing a hero's journey to think about a film and to get more out of a movie. I would say that as television seasons, that was the other part of John's question, as television seasons tend to become shorter, tend to sometimes be, thoroughly focused on at least series being only one season long, or there being dramatic changes in series almost to an anthology degree between one season and another. I think the same thing can happen or can be used, the same technique can be used for a television season. It's just a longer form of storytelling. So I would think in general, the same rules would apply, though with obviously far more sort of subplots and secondary and tertiary characters and sort of other roads gone down rather than the main hero's main journey over 8 or 10 or 12 hours versus something that's usually 2 hours. But all in all, I think this can be an interesting way to think about a movie. I don't think it's necessarily very interesting, a very useful or interesting way to think about all movies, but there's virtually no technique or critical lens, I should say, that is so useful and interesting for every single movie. So the hero's journey is no different. It's a perfectly valid way to consider a film and can be a very interesting one. Thanks for the question. Our next question today comes from Jerry. Jerry asks, why did Westerns make such a comeback in the 1960s and 70s? Well, I don't know that I fully accept the premise of the question. There certainly were a number of Westerns in the 60s and 70s that were successful and popular and dynamic and brought new life to the genre, but a comeback implies that the genre ever went away. And as I'm sure you'd agree, the 1950s were a very big decade for the Western, not the least of which being High Noon or The Searchers or Shane. So, but that being said, if we take the question to mean why were the 1960s and 70s such big decades for Westerns, there are a couple of answers. One answer is television. Though the movie industry in the 1950s was very nervous about television and thought of it only or almost exclusively as a competitor, they, before too long, learned that television was going to be a very good sort of secondary market for their movies. So that meant that they could alter their calculus on what movies they produced a little bit to consider the appeal of those movies for television. And Westerns were very popular on television. There were a lot of Western television series, and Western movies played very often and very well on television. So making more Westerns for the movies gave more Westerns for the movies to settle television. So that's part of the reason. Another reason was over the course of the 1960s and 70s, American society changed a great deal. And there were filmmakers who were interested in acknowledging that change or sort of discussing that change in their films, or sort of looking at some of the issues surrounding those changes. And Westerns have always been a very good genre for sort of dealing with social problems in mass entertainment. One is they're originally an American genre and sort of have always very closely been linked with the US in terms of a genre. And of course, they're always about, when they're set in the US, they're always about relevant issues to the United States, whether it's sort of interracial relations. Think about The Searchers being a film that was about relations between white settlers and Native Americans, but standing in when it came out in 1956 for a discussion about relationships between white Americans and African Americans. So the Westerns have always been good for that. Questions of technology, questions of law and order versus chaos, questions of the individual against the group, questions of individual against nature. The Western's great for all these. And with the exception, I guess, of the perhaps nature and technology questions, specifically in the 60s and 70s, notions of how we thought about those other themes or those other conflicts were changing significantly. So people were very eager to have those things discussed in movies. And of course, Westerns being set in the past allowed issues from the present to be discussed sort of at a safe distance. In addition, because the Western was for so long a very sort of traditional genre that didn't change all that much, at least in terms of its views of society and different groups within society and morality from the 20s through the 50s, then when the 60s and 70s come along and there are changes, I mean, the counterculture and changes in sort of what should be the primary considerations of a society and questions about what institutions in society should be valued and which are right and wrong, and sort of looking at long-standing social mores changing by taking the Western genre and putting new spins on it with anti-heroes and downright outlaws being heroes and things like that. It's a genre that sort of lends itself to asking those questions, to depicting challenges of authority, revisions of the social order, etc. So both because of its sort of long-standing place in culture in terms of being appealing for mass audiences, particularly on television, as well as for being a great vehicle for depicting or sort of engaging with changes going on in the society in the 60s and 70s. The Westerns were really popular during those decades. And that's why they were made. I should say that there was a decline in the number of Westerns made during those decades, but there was a decline in the number of all movies Hollywood was making during those decades. I think Westerns sort of fell more as a percentage of films being made, aside from the number of total films being made from the 50s and decades before that. In part, this is because some of the questions of law and order and other themes that the Westerns engaged with began, particularly in the 70s, being dealt with in police films or sort of urban crime films. Think about the remake, Fort Apache, The Bronx. Think about Dirty Harry, and you can see how those themes from the Western, or those conflicts from the Western, are being brought to other genres. So that's part of the reason for the decline, I think. But as the person who sent in the question notes, they certainly were still a big presence in the 60s and into the 70s. And there were a number of notable films from the Western genre made during those times. And those are some of the reasons why. So thanks for the question. And thank you for watching this edition of Ask Andrew. If you have a film question that's sort of been lingering in the back of your head, please visit the Film Studies Online section of brynmarfilm.org and submit a question to me via Ask Andrew. And if I have some idea of an answer to it and it seems like a number of people would be interested in it, maybe I'll answer it in a coming edition. Thanks so much for watching.